almost 13 million graduates in China are about to join the labor market over the summer as they finish their university studies. But Cheng Yang, there aren't that many jobs available for them, are there?
Yes, Mariko, and it has been bad for a while, just as AI is threatening to take more entry-level jobs.
Yeah, so today we're asking what can China's government do to make sure there are enough jobs for young people? I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. And I have Cheng Yang from the BBC's Chinese language service. Welcome to Asia Pacific, Yan.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting.
And I also have Professor Kailing Shen from Australian National University. Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Yeah, I'm glad to join.
So, firstly, Yan, let's start by painting the picture because this youth unemployment issue, it's not new, is it? I remember the authorities suspending the release of that data because it was so bad for quite some time, I think about 3 years ago. So, in comparison, how bad is the situation? Has it gotten worse compared to, say, 3 years ago?
Yes, you're right. The reason because 3 years ago, when Chinese government are so sensitive about this data is because it's so bad at that time. And the main reason at that time is because after COVID-19, the economic growth is not recovering as expected. So a slower economy means fewer jobs to be created. And the past several years, another demographic factor plays in this crisis is because every year the college graduates has hits a new record high. This year is another record high, it's 12.7 million college graduates, which is creates a lot of extra attention for the market to absorb. And also the Chinese economy is still slowing down. And this year the Chinese government has set the GDP growth rate at 4.5 to 5% as the target, and which is relatively high compared to other countries, but in Chinese standard, it's quite low. And I think the late Premier Li Keqiang in China has famously said that in the Chinese context, 1% of GDP growth roughly creates 2 million new jobs. So 4.5 to 5% GDP growth translate to roughly 9 to 10 million new jobs. But the college graduates is 12.7 million. So you see the gap over there. The gap is itself creates a lot of attention, a lot of sentimental issues for the young people in China.
Yeah, and if you can just explain, how does it work? Because, we keep hearing about how China's population is shrinking. So how is the number of newly grads, university grads, keeps going up in China?
Because the new elementary students that entering elementary school, they drop sharply because in the past few years, the Chinese population shrunk and the newborns have been shrunk significantly. But the newly graduates, they were born 18 years ago, 20 years ago. At that time, that was the peak of this population growth. So right now, when they grow up, when they get into college, 20 years later, they're creating a new peak each year at the past several years. But you can imagine, like 15 years later, the Chinese will facing a crisis of a labor crisis.
Kailin, you've been looking at the Chinese economy and the jobs market for some 20 years. So how bad is the situation? Yan talked about how obviously the COVID-19 pandemic affected the labor market and the economy hasn't recovered. But in comparison, for the duration that you've been looking at the Chinese market, has the situation, youth unemployment situation, been this bad in your view?
I don't think the current situation is as bad or is considered as bad as one during the global financial crisis. That's 2008, 2009. I vividly remembered when I was still stationed in China and how people feel very astonished because that is a situation with great contrast. Both I remember in October 2008, the CCTV is still the theme is how can we control the speed of the economic boom. But then suddenly over a month, then the whole thing flipped. So that is a very big shock. But currently in China, I think there is a different flavor, especially currently with all the EV and other industries. The whole momentum, the country basically are not have that certain level of confidence, especially the young people. No one considering this is solvable in 2 years, and no one thinking this is all only about China, because we see in many countries with the transition brought about or predicted by all the big AI companies, most young people around the world are worrying about their future.
Yeah, absolutely. The AI shock is definitely not just a China specific thing. You mentioned CCTV, which is a state broadcaster of China. You were just talking about during the global financial crisis. Would you say the frustration level, because you said you were still in China at the time, was there quite a lot of frustration among young people not being able to find work, or because it was such a global issue, were people kind of more okay with it?
No one from the government to ordinary people have any idea about how long this will last or whether this will resolve eventually. So very desperate, pessimistic, I would say, at that point. But now with this has been experienced, the full cycle, I guess people are a little bit more resilient, and there would be people would think this is just a thing that eventually will pick up somehow.
So I still remember my years during the financial crisis. I graduated 2012, which is the Chinese economy just recovers from the financial crisis shock. And at that year, the economy was quite good. We have fewer college graduates and higher growth rate when I graduated. And right now, the students nowadays, they are facing twice of a newly graduates, but much lower of a growth rate. So the pressure is over there, very obviously created over there. So the students nowadays, when they graduate, they see their older cousins, they see their parents, they will realize that they can land a job at their days quite easily compared to what they are facing.
I actually feel very shocked by the magnitude of the government dumping money to the economy, which is in 2009, 2010. That's really big scale projects and the dumping of money, just as if the whole economy is going under and we are going to save it. Otherwise, we're all going to die, like that kind of momentum. And kind of when we reflect back nowadays, there is a certain reflection saying maybe we have overshoot. We might can handle that with less dumping of the money, because that has its negative consequences later on as the real estate market was really booming up and become so hot.
Yan, you spoke to a lot of young people as part of your reporting. How do they feel about it? I remember there was that concept of lying flat, but I was reading how that became from kind of a niche subculture to now part of mainstream. So how do those unemployed young people feel these days, Yang?
The one guy I talked to who is a PhD graduate, he landed a job in state-owned enterprises in Shanghai, which is a pharmaceutical research company. And he said that there's a quite opportunity funding him, not him, to seek a opportunity. And the need is over there is real, because I think there's a policy push behind it. The state-owned companies have to hire more at this harsh job environment, because the government wants those state-owned companies to stabilize the job market. But on the other hand, some newly graduates are quite frustrating. I talked to a young girl who is in Shanghai right now, who used to study in Xiamen province, Xiamen University. And she told me that she is very struggling to even find an internship, which is a transaction period to a real job. And she sends like 200 of resume to different kind of companies, but he couldn't get one in the advertisement industry. And he relies on his family to provide for her for rent and groceries.
Yeah, that would be a very frustrating and difficult situation, wouldn't it? Kailing, you mentioned the AI shock affecting not just China, but the entire world, where the technology may be replacing the entire entry level jobs in many companies. Do you think China is facing this problem kind of differently from the rest of the world because of such a high adoption rate of the technology?
From the technical side, I think there's not much difference for companies worldwide. But in terms of how they react, I think Chinese economy is very flexible. What we observe, for example, during the global financial crisis, is companies originally was targeting to hire a 4-year graduates. Now they are hiring 3 years college graduates. So they're very flexible. Whatever makes them make profit, that's what they are going to do. On the other side, the flexibility of the Chinese labor market means you do see people transiting from different positions. One day they're a manager, another day they might be a nanny. Like the market do not put a harsh penalty for people. You can jumping around, and that kind of freedom not widely seen in many other economies. You do have a baggage of where you coming from. I look at your LinkedIn or whatever, right? So, but in China, who cares? So long as you can do the job, you will get it. So that's one thing. Probably a lot of newly graduate university students do not realize how much freedom they actually can have. It's especially more difficult for newly graduates because all the new graduates, unless they have ever made any efforts, they look very similar to each other. They all from the computer science degree, all have a good marks. Nothing makes them different. But after 1 or 3 years, they start to show their own branding, and that's where the matching becomes much easier.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good tip for not just Chinese students, but any other newly grads who are facing a very similar issue elsewhere as well. Just wondering though, Kailing, you said the Chinese labor market is more flexible than others. Where do you think that flexibility comes from?
So the Chinese economy, one is a state-owned public sector employment, and besides that, everything else is so flexible. There is the minimum rules, and even sometimes there are rules. It's not implemented. It's the general momentum of most people. They do not depend on the government to provide this social safety net. The social safety net is only for these extreme populations.
And I also want to point out that the college graduates right now who is graduating is born at the early 2000s. And at that period of time, China is still under one-child policy. And just like me and my wife, we are all in the one-child family. And at the early stage of our career, even though we couldn't land a job, the family is more than happy to help us to get through this period. That's what Kailing said about the social safety net, which I think is quite unique in China's context.
Yeah, no, just going back to the AI shock that Kailing talked about, you spoke to a lot of those young people who can't get a job. How do they feel about this AI shock? Because, you know, we've done an episode on whether even having a university degree these days is even, you know, valuable because all the entry level jobs seem to be replaced by the technology. How do Chinese youth feel about the AI and the technology, the threat and the opportunities that it potentially poses?
The PhD graduates I talked to who land a researcher job, he said he barely AI was barely mentioned during his job requiring process. I was quite surprised by that. The reason behind it, because for one, the company he goes into is a state-owned company, which is not as panicking or responsive to AI shock. And the other is that because his higher end of job is more like research and experiment, which is not that easy to be replaced by AI. But on the other hand, some students, the one intern that I talked to, that when he go into the work he was doing, the fourth day, he realized all his daily work can be replaced by AI. What she do is to running a social media account, to write copyright, to write monthly and weekly reports. She's seeing that all this work can be done by AI perfectly, and most of the time it's better than what the intern have to do. So he was quite in the mood of being replaced, the fear of being replaced. One company called Gympark, which has which is doing advertisement kind of a thing, promoting, and they have an office in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore. And the CEO and the founder told me that they used to have 5 internships every year in Hong Kong. And this February, when the OpenClaw, which is the AI agent, came about, and they implement the OpenClaw quite intensively in their workflow. So they have 4 OpenClaw, which can perfectly replace those 5 interns job. So this summer, they don't have any interns, and they don't have any plans to recruiting any newly graduates because the cost is too vast.
Kai-Ling, I'm just curious, if these companies are choosing not to hire those very junior entry-level staff now, what are they going to do, in the foreseeable future when they have to replace this mid to senior level staff? I mean, they can't exactly replace all the jobs by AI, or can they?
Our young people, they are the future, not just because today they're begging for some jobs to be paid, but because what they like, what they appreciate, will demand what product and what service will prevail in the market. Already in Chinese market, you see all the alcohol are not sold because young people don't drink. Right? There's many things those young people will dictate what our future will look like. Any company say, we don't any young people in our company, so we still want the business of this younger generation. That just doesn't work.
And I want to jump in on that is that there's a concept of the one PC, which is quite hot right now in Chinese social media.
What is it?
It's one PC, one person company.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it's one founder who is dictating like a dozen of AI agents to help him to realize his ideas. And they can be a small business by its own. It's 1 man and 12 AI agent. And so if that becomes a more common thing in the future, maybe the whole structure of a company need to be rethink and to be reinvented.
What do you think, Kai-Ling? I mean, we were recently talking about how this unemployment situation, especially among the country's youth, is resulting in weak consumption. People just aren't spending enough money in China. And even though the Chinese government has announced various measures, it hasn't really worked. Do you think Beijing will have to do more to address this youth unemployment situation? Because I'm sure it is creating quite a bit of frustration for the parents as well as the graduates.
In the long run, if for this all young generation be able to shift or transform the production function of the society, probably they need to, that's what my suggestion is, go to pick up whatever jobs, how mundane is, just so that you know the context. Spend some time, and later on you can complement that knowledge, which is hard earned, with your AI skills. That's where your unique branding coming from.
That's a really good advice for all the young students, not just in China, but around the world. Thank you so much for joining me, Kai-Ling and Yang.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Mariko Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email, asiapacific@bbc.co.uk, and click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.